to share our next guest, Ethan Gordon, who's just hopping in as a panelist now, and talking to us from his work in regenerative agriculture as a researcher about relational values in not permaculture and regen ag. Sorry, I'm just doing tech while I'm also talking at the same time. So instead of putting words in Ethan's mouth, I'll hand over to you, Ethan, and let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Toad. Thanks, Guy. Well, can you see me? I'm here. Should I change my name is back at the front.
It's all good. You're a panelist now, so we can see you and hear you.
Great. Excellent. Um, Thanks for having me. Great to be here, everyone. I'll just get my slides up. Can everyone see that? Hang on.
We can see the
And
slides.
it's big screen. It's not my
Ah,
like
big
back.
screen now.
Right. So I actually think I only came in for the last little bit of Maya's talk, but I think this talk will follow on quite well from her comment about um, what we need to do is just actually care and act as if we care. And that is a lot about what I'm going to be talking about today. So the talk is based on a recent paper that I published with my colleagues at Oregon State University and some other universities, but mainly Oregon State, in relational values in regenerative agriculture. And I'll explain a bit about what they are and why they're significant in a moment. But for those who don't know me, I'm a researcher at Oregon State University, but I'm also the president of the Australian Institute of Ecological Agriculture, which is a volunteer-run cooperative which is interested in shifting practice and philosophy around agriculture in a more sort of ecological and regenerative direction. And we have about 170 members, mostly farmers, but also educators and consultants in regen ag. I'll probably talk for like maybe 35 or 40 minutes. And then hopefully there'll be time at the end for questions. But yeah, keep note of any questions as they come up because there's a lot of content in my slides. So hopefully we can have a rich chat at the end. And I'll start with an acknowledgement of country, especially since relationships with country are the real heart of what we're talking about when it comes to relational values. And I'm currently on Wurundjeri land in Naarm, but I come from a place in the crossover lands of the Gumbaynggirr Dunghutti and Anaiwan peoples. And this photo on the screen is a photo from that place. And all the research and advocacy work that I've done has stemmed from my relationship with that specific land. And I've got a big sense of responsibility towards it, which funnily enough is a relational value. So ties in. So I'd like to extend my respects to not only to the country that I'm on today and those elders past, present, and emerging, but also the country that has inspired all of the work that I've been doing. So relational values are values that emerge from specific relationships between people and the rest of nature. So between, say, pastoralists and their herds, or with a particular tree or with a particular place, all meaningful relationships between people that happen in nature. And they're interesting because they're not scalable, if that makes sense, because they relate to the unique relationships that they emerge from. So if you move beyond the scale of those relationships, then you lose the context and meaning of the value. And when we talk about values, more typically, we often talk about broad values like justice, love, integrity, compassion, and those sorts of things. And these are more like ideals or general principles compared with relational values because they can apply regardless of context, whereas relational values can't apply regardless of context. Relational values also sidestep a dichotomy between intrinsic values, where nature has inherent value regardless of whether people are engaged with it or not, and instrumental values, where nature has value by benefiting people, like contributing to the economy, increasing or increasing yields, are both like things that are based on instrumental values. And pretty much all or most of our policies about nature are based on instrumental values in society. Or a lot of environmental organizations and advocates will draw on intrinsic values to argue for nature's inherent rights. But relational values sit in a different place, and they're really embedded in the cultures of indigenous peoples all around the world. And they show how nature has cultural and spiritual significance beyond utilitarian benefits or separating people from nature altogether. And the Intergovernmental Policy Science Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services in 2022, IPBES, released a values assessment that showed how cultivating these relational values could inspire mindset shifts that might support agricultural transformations. And we need agricultural transformations. This is a photo from the farm that I grew up on in 2019 and 2020 during the Black Summer bushfires. So personally, I mean, connecting back to the acknowledgement, I'm so aware of the volatile impacts of climate change and fear, as we all should, the increase in their severity and frequency. And so when I'm talking about transformations, I'm talking about a radical shift in the social and cultural structures of society. And I was recently involved with another IPBES report, which is the Transformative Change Assessment, which came after the Values Assessment. And this is how it defined transformative change. They talk about a deliberate transformative change for a just and sustainable world, shifts views, structures, and practices in ways that address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss and nature's decline. And what's actually really good about the IPBES Transformative Change Assessment is this focus on underlying causes, because not really any other research assessment at that level has acknowledged or talked about the underlying causes of biodiversity loss and nature's decline. And the report identified 3 underlying causes. The first one was disconnection from and domination over nature and people, concentration of power and wealth, and a prioritization of short-term individual and material gains. And so what is really clear here is that this is not actually an environmental crisis. It is fundamentally a cultural and political crisis that has environmental consequences. And it therefore requires a cultural and political change. And that's exactly what we're talking about over the course of this program, the decomposing power, divesting power, and redistributing power. And so my main point, I suppose, in this presentation is that this kind of transformation can be facilitated by a change in values emphasis. And what I mean by that is a change in the types of values that we prioritize in our society when we're making decisions. But unfortunately, relational values have often been dismissed by people operating in Western value systems. And you hear classic things like they detract from real and measurable conservation, or they're kind of fluffy and intangible. And what we actually want is like real and often technology-driven solutions to the crisis that we're facing. And this reveals a real flaw in our thinking, because it's very possible to live in and build a society based around values of care for each other and the rest of nature. And evidence of that is in the livelihoods and knowledge systems of over 476 million Indigenous peoples across at least 90 countries that are based around relational values. And it has proven to be sustainable when we take these kinds of values seriously. And so I'm going to share some specific manifestations of relational values and what they look like in regenerative agriculture. The first one is around identity. So in our research, some farmers that we spoke with expressed a sense of place attachment, kinship, and identity as part of nature. And they said things like, the land is part of who we are, it's our life. Our agricultural community is part of nature. And the idea of regeneration has given many farmers a new identity as someone who can help prevent climate change and biodiversity loss rather than perpetuate it. And in a paper by Hannah Gosnell, conventional farmers actually realized that their actions didn't align with their stewardship values. But for many, regen ag better reflected the kinds of farmers they wanted to be. And what's interesting here is that many relational values are already sitting dormant in all farmers, most farmers certainly. They all have them, but they're not prioritized because the broader system doesn't allow for them to be prioritized. But what is significant here is that regenerative ag allowed some farmers to act on relational values that they already held. Another manifestation of relational values is what it means to live a good and meaningful life through relationships with nature, defining what it means to live a good and meaningful life through relationships with nature. And this includes revitalizing good living philosophies or a sense of right livelihood amongst farmers. And through relational values, many farmers didn't measure success based on profitability or productivity alone, but by stewardship and time spent recreationally or nurturing community and family. And actually, rarely in our research so far has profit been a main motivator of either conventional or regenerative ranchers, because I work with ranchers, of their work. And it's often actually their way of life that motivates their decision making. And like all of us, the profit just comes in because you need a financial resource to sustain the way of life of living on the land. So some relational values were associated with a sense of place or sacred and cultural connections to specific places. And this aligned well with interpretations of regen ag that talk about it as a place-sourced practice that, like relational values, can't be replicated or scaled across the world because it's context-specific. And a major contributor to having a sense of place is embodied learning, like the experience of being in a landscape. And this can include like spending time in the fields, walking with your animals, listening to the land. And it's really important because we're getting beyond the scientific and intellectual realm and into a knowledge space that is more embodied and experiential. One farmer said, you've got to get your hands in the ground and feel it to understand it. Sense of place relational values also come back to how relationships in many places have been violently severed by colonial agriculture. And a 2023 paper by Sam Buckton said this: a system arguably cannot be regenerative if it is not emancipatory and fails to right such injustice, like if it exists on stolen land or does not enable resource sovereignty. So from a relational values perspective, working regeneratively requires considering the biocultural history of a place, and all relationships have to navigate power dynamics. And subsequently, values inspired by relationships are also implicated in the politics of power. So when we talk about relational values that emerge out of specific relationships, that has to come with an awareness of where power sits if we want to connect in meaningful and reciprocal ways. And in many cases, a redistribution of power may be necessary. And this is something that actually should be really front of mind for the regeneration movement, but isn't always. So let's just take a step back and ask ourselves, what is regeneration? So we're on the same page about that. This is a definition on the screen from the transformative change assessment again, that it's dynamic processes of renewal or recreation of desired outcomes, often after disturbance. And the disturbance part is important because, I mean, whether that is colonial violence or soil degradation or something else, if there was no disturbance, then we would be talking about generative agriculture as opposed to regenerative. But the thing that I'd really like to point out in this quote at the processes of renewal space is that what's really important is that in regeneration, the agency to regenerate is conceded back to nature as a whole. It's not up to people as individuals because people are interacting within a regenerating ecosystem. I love this quote from Edgar Burns, who says, this is a radical idea of empowering and not controlling nature. And the second quote on the screen here also speaks to that, which is from John Fisher. And it says, regeneration suggests humans co-evolving and participating as nature Restoration refers to humans doing things to nature. And that's like the key distinction. The key distinction is this idea that distinctions between people and the rest of nature need to be collapsed in order to actually understand what regenerative means. And participating as nature means conceding some control over ecosystems, like reducing inputs of fertilizers and pesticides, to allow natural systems to better regulate their own health. And this is often articulated by regenerative farmers as working with Mother Nature, not against her. You'll often hear that from farmers. So Masanobu Fukuoka, who's the originator of natural or do-nothing farming, initially quit all jobs like plowing and weeding, arguing that nature could manage itself if humans stopped interfering. But when he quit, the land had already been shaped by years of human intervention, and the agro-ecosystem did not balance out, as I presume he hoped. And in fact, weeds and pests overran his crops. So conceding control does not mean that humans stop interacting with the farm. On later attempts, Fukuoka realized that a do-nothing farming still required a thoughtful collaboration with the rest of nature. And this photo on the screen I really love because it comes from Krishna McKenzie, who runs Solitude Farm. And he was a student of Fukuoka's, and this is a signed copy of Fukuoka's book, The One Straw Revolution. And it shows exactly that do-nothing philosophy of sitting under a tree and letting the fruits of nature fall into your mouth, which is what is happening. And I've spoken to numerous regenerative ranchers in the US who say that their main goal is to cause the ranch to manage itself in a natural way. And I'd love to read one quote. It's long, but I just love it so much that I have to share it from a study that I'm currently working on, which sums it up beautifully. They say Wright's false willow is the only known plant species that painted grasshopper nymphs can survive on. If we did something to remove that plant from our landscape, we would then no longer have painted grasshopper nymphs. And who knows how many other species of insects or invertebrates depend on that plant. Species work together to keep each other in check. It's a system of checks and balances. If you remove some of those species artificially, or they're extirpated from a landscape, all of a sudden another species becomes dominant. And all of a sudden, you have a grasshopper infestation that is eating all your forage for your cattle. So to me, the number one thing we can do is keep our chain of biodiversity intact. But as soon as we lose that, we start creating problems everywhere that we can't control. And then anthropological means start coming in. Man starts trying to fix some of the problems that he's created, and it's just a continual litany of unintended consequences. So for us, our main goal is to cause this ranch to manage itself in a natural way. And I just think this is a beautiful summation of regenerative philosophy in a practical way. By conceding some control in this way and allowing biodiversity to return, farmers or ranchers are in a small way distributing power more evenly throughout the ecosystem. The fourth grouping of relational values that we looked at were associated with care and responsibility between specific landscapes, places, humans, and more than humans. And as mentioned, most conventional farmers already feel a responsibility to care for land, and regen ag has become a pathway for acting on that. There was a great quote that came out of my PhD where a regen farmer said, "I do a greeting to the sun every morning, and it reminds me of not just who I am, but what my responsibilities are to the earth." And there's a real sense in the academic literature too that it's important to be attentive to the land. Well, it depends which academic literature. And in another great paper by Dana James, they say responsibility towards the land and its inhabitants requires direct action through relationship. And they offer a super great example of this. They say to consume fish means to be in relationship with water. So in this relationship, reciprocity requires care for the water through research, policy, advocacy, and by guaranteeing communities access to the water in perpetuity. And that is what taking responsibility for that relationship to water means. A lot of regen ag is about reforming the relationships that farmers have with the land, and that can be a messy process. So there's many types of regeneration. Looks like many different things. But a big part of this is replacing technologically driven monocultural production with softer approaches that require this kind of attentiveness to place. And one paper we reviewed said the relationship of humans to natural systems is not inherently extractive or harmful, but can be generative in a symbiotic sense. When I first heard about regenerative agriculture, I was in Southeast India. And during the French occupation there, all of the tropical dry evergreen forests that were native to the area were cut down. And it was a desert for ages. But 50 odd years ago, efforts to regenerate these forests started, and they were using Australian acacias. And there's a reason why they're using Australian acacia. It's because they have great nitrogen fixing capabilities. And so they call the acacia over there, they call it the work tree. It has this spiritual significance of work. And why I love acacia so much is because the type of work that acacia does is regenerative work. And so I visited one regeneration site called Sadana Forest, and the acacias were doing a great job. But what really surprised me was how much the land had regenerated where the humans actually lived. And I think permaculturalists probably understand this better than anyone, but people can have a deeply regenerative impact on a place if they are living according to values that allow for that. And at Sadana Forest, runoff from the kitchen was feeding banana trees, and food attracted animals. And just by existing, the residents there attracted life. And this is an aerial shot of Sadana Forest. And you can see on the edges of the photo, the fields where they're planting acacias. And that's kind of sort of, gets a bit drier on there on the edges. But the real regenerative density is right there around the huts. And I like this story because it speaks so much to that last quote that we can't take for granted this idea that humans are harmful when actually human relationships with the rest of nature are not inherently extractive or harmful. It's just the values that we've based our society on. Final manifestation of relational values that I'd like to talk about is human connections through nature. And when nature becomes a point of connection between people, these relational values can have a significant impact on the transformative potential of regenerative agriculture. And this is because they're directly relevant to issues of equity and power in the food system. There's many examples of how regeneration increases social connections between people, but I want to focus here on the political implications. And firstly, supportive relationships as a baseline sustain people's motivation to adopt different practices and stick with them. They also connect people to this idea of being in a movement, which is a powerful idea. And whether that's via WhatsApp or email or catch-ups to exchange knowledge or support each other or share stories or politically advocate. And regen ag is also about the regeneration of farming livelihoods and rural communities after the socially extractive activities of industrial agriculture. And this is particularly relevant as rural landscapes are increasingly emptied and ownership of land becomes more and more centralized. And what is really important in all of this is protecting traditional knowledges and food sovereignty. It's a political necessity, and prioritizing relational values deepens how people feel about the significance of these ideas. And the reason that that relational values do that is because food sovereignty is a political framework that protects those place-based, meaningful relationships with the rest of nature that are also the source of relational values. And so I'm assuming everyone knows that what food sovereignty is, given the topic of the program, but it's the right of peoples to nutritious and culturally appropriate food, to defining their own food system and growing food in ecologically sound ways. And in a paper by Lee Frankel Goldwater, which came out of the US, 41.9% of farmers mentioned the importance of justice when talking about their relational values. Compounding historic injustices mean that agriculture cannot be regenerative without an explicit focus on relationships that are equitable and restorative. So relational values between people actually make regeneration socially responsible, not just economically and ecologically sound. And I think if you're a non-Indigenous person farming in a settler colonial context like Australia is, and you truly want to be regenerative, then taking that concept of regeneration to its natural end means at some point you will need to think about what it means to be farming stolen land. Regenerative practices like those listed on the screen there all have come out of all have Indigenous origins and evolved alongside specific relational values in Indigenous communities. But through colonization, many of these agricultural knowledges have been co-opted by the West, and this has meant a dismembering of regenerative practices from the relational values that historically guided their application. So I think as a good example is biochar and Amazonian dark earths, terra preta. They roughly share the same origins, but the way they have evolved reflects differences in Western and Indigenous ideas of human nature relationships. Biochar has evolved predominantly on the basis of instrumental values, and consequently, it lends itself to industrialization and private markets. Whereas terra preta is embedded in relational values, which makes it more able to support Indigenous people's rights, livelihoods, and cultural practices. If regenerative practices are reconnected to relational values, this creates a feedback loop for sustaining relational values in regenerative agriculture and sustaining regenerative practices through relational values. And there's a good example of this in a paper I mentioned earlier by Dana James, where they reflected on a value amongst Indigenous groups in Canada, which was that enacting respect for the living world entails honouring the gifts of life. And consequently, when hunting bison with that value, all parts of the animal were used because wasting its life would mean disrespecting the gifts provided. And in this way, the relational value of honouring gifts also sustains best practice, which I think demonstrates well the link that exists between values and practices. So what does all of this mean for regenerative agriculture as a movement? I want to just take you back for a moment to how regenerative ag has classically been defined. And a Catalyst paper in 2020 by Peter Newton divided it up into process-based definitions, which are concerned with practices and principles like integrating livestock, and outcomes-based definitions, which are concerned with results like carbon sequestration, or some combination of both of these. But what really stood out to me in this paper is that they also offered a possibility that relational values might form another dimension of this, which wasn't captured in their research, and that regen farmers may favour certain processes due to a values relationship with the natural world, rather than this belief that the practices that they're using will necessarily lead to a particular outcome. And basically, the main proposal of this paper that we've written is that hunch was spot on, and there is a values distinction in regenerative agriculture that can be made, which is here on the screen. Productivist regeneration, that is, regeneration defined by the goal of productivity, remains primarily embedded in instrumental values that leave it open to greenwashing and co-optation by multinational corporations predominantly. And on the other side, you have relational regeneration, which foregrounds the regeneration of reciprocal human-human and human nature relationships through agriculture. And this groups who are basing their actions in this realm predominantly take a grassroots, bottom-up approach to transforming food systems around these values. But what's really important to point out here is that this distinction is not a neat one, and it's not binary, because people value nature in many ways and many diverse and overlapping ways. And everyone draws on both instrumental and relational values. They shouldn't be pitted against each other. Instrumental values are not bad inherently. And often, actually, these values coexist and can support each other when making changes. For example, you might have a farmer who wants to protect nature because ecosystem services improve production, which is an instrumental rationale for doing that. But simultaneously, they may want to protect nature because stewarding the land is central to their identity as a farmer and attachment to the place, which is a relational rationale for protection. So what we're saying here is not that it should be one or the other, like relational values and no instrumental values. Instead, the distinction here is made by which values are given higher importance and priority when it's time to make decisions. And our findings suggest that many productivist framings of regen overemphasize instrumental values and neglect relational values. And in contrast, relational regeneration foregrounds relational values, but also embraces the importance of production and profitability and some of those more instrumental things. So it's a more holistic approach. It's also important to note that the productivist approach does not and actually cannot address those underlying causes of biodiversity loss and nature's decline that I was talking about in the beginning. And this is because it doesn't reflect the necessary cultural change required for the cultural crisis. But the relational regen does necessitate a mindset shift in how society values nature. Prioritizing relational values can often go alongside a new way of seeing and experiencing the land. And it's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation, but seeing the land relationally, whether it's like through holistic thinking or systems thinking, creates space for cultivating relational values. And on the flip side, cultivating relational values can help people start to think in a more relational way. And during my PhD, I spoke with some animist farmers. And animism is or has been the dominant belief all around the world forever and a day that the natural world or material reality is inspirited or inhabited with nature spirits. And this belief returns farmers to an ancient and sacred world that honestly is hard for the post-enlightenment reductionist and rational mind, which dominates our world today, to comprehend. And I had one farmer who explained to me their shamanic journeying to better communicate with the spirits of their garden. And one plant spirit, appeared to them to have a conversation about weeding, to help them make decisions about weeding. And this kind of story is one we can get very uncomfortable even talking about in the West, let alone conceding that it might be real. And so that same farmer said to me this quote, and I just think it's amazing. I've had conversations with plants and animals in my journeys that lead me to believe that everything is conscious. Even the rocks are conscious. And what's the worst thing that can happen if you believe that? Nothing. And I really love this point because whilst some might disregard the spiritual realm, by contrast, believing that everything is not conscious but inert has led to such immense harm and a loss of respect for the earth that it's now become an existential threat to humanity and many other species. So I think this is just such a good invitation to some humble reflection about whose views are valuable as we navigate, hopefully, out of the cultural crisis that we find ourselves in. So coming back to the distinction, this productivist relational difference in how regen groups organize themselves, in my opinion, is more critical to regen ag's transformative potential than the process outcomes distinction that Peter Newton proposed. And in fact, we should be talking about this distinction like a lot because it's already having massive implications for how regen ag is evolving and whether it's getting co-opted and greenwashed. Corporations that have been key actors in developing extractive food systems are now positioning themselves as leaders in regen, capitalizing on the definitional ambiguity of the space and publishing their preferred definitions, which are often actually based in instrumental values. And this risks co-optation, which is where non-adherents to regen ag appropriate and dilute and reinterpret it for their own political purposes. And co-optation has significant implications for the public perception of regeneration, sort of practical things like certification and labeling, the ability of farmers to adopt regen, and the cost of regen products or implementation. But by being able to articulate this productivist relational distinction, which has not been something we've been able to do in regen so far, advocates of regenerative are better able to defend against co-optation because they can highlight the importance of the relational mindset and subsequent shift in the values that we're prioritizing. And it's this kind of values shift that puts humanity on the right path for addressing the cultural crisis. So this is a slide worth taking a screenshot of. What we did at the end of this paper is that we developed a list of checking questions that can be used as a reflexive tool for ensuring yourself, but also others you interact with or other people in the regen movement are engaged in relational regeneration. And it's actually funny, when the paper was reviewed, the reviewers thought that this was kind of the useless part of the paper, and maybe we shouldn't have it in there. And I think that's probably because they couldn't see how it would contribute to the academic literature. But in my mind and in the mind of practitioners I've spoken with, this is the most useful piece of the entire thing. So these questions are intended as a useful tool for considering how regen is being conceptualized and how it's being defined and how it's being discussed. And hopefully it will help identify cases of greenwashing and co-optation, or simply seeing how much productivist regen there is out there versus relational approaches. So I'll go through these one at a time. The first checking question is the interpretation of regeneration foregrounding reciprocal relationships? And this ensures that the discourse we're using, the way we're talking about regeneration, comes from that relational mindset that collapses distinctions between people and the rest of nature. Because if you don't come from that world, from that perspective, from that way of seeing and being in the world, then you'll just immediately misinterpret what regeneration means and interpret it more like restoration is classically interpreted. Is the interpretation of regen reconnecting relational values with regenerative practices or principles? Across all sustainable agriculture movements, the many practices and principles that emerge from Indigenous peoples' cultures have been disconnected from their original cultural contexts and values. And equitable transformations are more likely if actions are connected to values that reinforce the responsibilities involved in human and more than human relationships. So relinking those two, practices and relational values, is really important. Thirdly, is the interpretation of regen adaptable to different places? For some, regen ag has become a specific agricultural practice based on soil health principles. But that is not what it is. Regen ag applies the adjective of regeneration to the noun of agriculture. So it doesn't have a set approach. It's simply making the concept of agriculture one that prioritizes and supports the agency of a place to regenerate. So there are many agricultures that are or can be regenerative. In a paper by George Cusworth, they refer to the McDonaldization of regen, which is the mainstreaming, scaling up and globalizing of a single and replicable model of regen ag. And this sort of thing is the risk. This risks undermining other transformative approaches that may already exist at the local level, like agroecology. And since relational values are sustained through actual relationships on the ground, it's important to ensure that regen is also place-sourced and complementary to other values-aligned movements like agroecology. Number 4 is the interpretation of regen empowering Indigenous peoples and acknowledging their contributions. As we've discussed, Indigenous peoples founded many regen practices, and we need to consider how they benefit from the widespread application of their knowledges. And I think a good starting point is via the repatriation of their lands and livelihoods and the enabling of Indigenous people to participate in the agricultural economy in self-determined ways, which is certainly not happening at the moment. Is the interpretation of regen empowering local communities? Complete corporate control of the food system threatens the resilience of local communities. And relational values can be strengthened by grassroots movements and the opportunity for local people to be democratically involved in the food system via things like community supported agriculture. Again, agroecology does a really good job of this, and the relational values were central to the agroecological revolution in Latin America because it was motivated by indigenous and relational understandings of the world. But in regen, if lead actors in regen become global north corporations, not to say that corporations can't be involved, but if they become the leaders of regen, then this will absolutely reduce the transformative potential of the movement because it drowns out those global south voices, but it also drowns out the voices of local people, whether they're in the north or the south. The final one is the interpretation of regen empowering the more than human. As we've seen, a central tenet of regeneration is allowing nature to do the work by returning agency to the ecosystem. And so we always need to be considering how we distribute power back into the more than human world. So that is just about it. To finish up with a final comment, if we are to transform food systems and redistribute power away from the monolithic industrial and extractive agriculture that we have, we need all the diverse sustainable ag movements working together, whether that's permaculture, agroecology, organics, biodynamics, holistic management. They all attract different people for different reasons. And together, all of these can be transformative so long as they're not pitted against one another, which can be a strategy to destabilize alternative movements, or co-opted, as we've talked about. And for me, the glue for this kind of collaboration is these relational values and relational ways of seeing the world. So it's critically important that regen and all these movements avoid co-optation that strips away the importance of this relationality, because that is how the movements, all of them, will be undermined. So there's a QR code there on the screen if you want to use it, which takes you to the academic paper to read or share or do whatever you like. And other than that, that is all that I have. And I think there should be plenty of time for questions, hopefully.
Yay. Oh my gosh, thank you. Thank you for presenting that. And thank you for all the research that's gone in. This is such a critical um, decolonial intervention because we see the co-option of any movement towards regenerative action, towards methodologies that can structurally empower Indigenous people and the land and give sovereignty back to itself, so that extraction cannot continue. And I think it really answers a difficult question of how do we put that definition and draw the
Mm,
line in a way that really does, help have a boundary for who actually carries that intent. Because, while regeneration doesn't have this, set definition, it
mm,
sits in this ambiguity that's really vulnerable. So I really appreciate the depth of distinction in here, and I can see how important this is for creating protections around regenerative practice and
mm.
ensuring that the work that is done doesn't constantly get undermined. So, yeah, yeah. First of all, thank you so much. It's so good to see you. It's so good to hear you. I feel like I always see you in these contexts. Well, that's because I live
Yeah,
in. But
that's
yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that, Guy. I think that just on the back of that, the whole processes outcomes distinction in regen ag and like, oh, is it about processes? Defining it that way is just like completely meaningless, really. I mean, you could
Mhm.
define it by practices or outcomes, but at the end of the day, it can still be completely co-opted, and that distinction does nothing to prevent that. You could
Mm,
focus on either, and it could still hurt the environment.
mm,
Whereas this, I think, really gives us a way of articulating what is transformative and putting boundaries up to protect that at a discourse level. But then at a
mm,
political level, we need things like food sovereignty that actually um, have a framework for protecting these relational ways of thinking.
Absolutely, and I think as we, continue on this decolonial pathway and towards what treaty looks like and real empowerment looks like in these spaces, we need to continue to redefine what that protection and how we don't drag these, harmful, assumptions about what this means and what that means. So yeah, really, really important. I can see the implications across these massively, harmful industries that are trying to move, incrementally towards change, and that this is a really awesome line in the sand about how we define that connection point. So yeah, amazing. We've got a few questions. Oh, actually, I'll pass to you, Toad, first before going to the questions and the Q&As.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I'm just echoing everything that Guy said, and I can really see the the beginning of that queer bridging between like very much people on the ground who are engaged in relational work and what a lot of us like queer, like we're just one of many who kind of focus on relational work and being able to kind of base so much of the work that we do is trying to advocate for and talk about the importance of relational values and the skill set required to be able to do that work well. Like two people often in academia, and the framing of this within academia is so powerful. And also speaking to, I can really see the tension there of like so much of modern agriculture, even such, and thus into regen ag in a lot of ways, has its histories in the plantation and interchangeability and scalability and mass extraction, and even that into academia, and being able to like how that interrupts that narrative of that is the correct way of doing things, and just wanted to speak to how that work is valuable, but also I'm sure that tension is real of trying to work with a group of people who their framework is how can we scale this? How does this fit within the traditional model? And what it's saying is the traditional model doesn't work. Just wanted to give attention to that tension, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I just like that's so it. Like the whole discussion about scaling, scaling sustainable solutions is like not where it's at. And you reminded me of a quote from one of the ranchers I interviewed recently, and it's just such a good quote. And he said, classic ranching is all about looking out, kind of and expanding, whereas regen ranching is about looking down. And yeah, looking down and like actually getting to know that the place that you're standing on. And that, to hear that from a rancher like in the middle of Wyoming or something, I'm like, yes, yeah.
Awesome. So just got a few wonderful responses. This is fascinating. Exactly the question I've been wrestling with the last year in my PhD, and why this larger movement has two distinct networks. Yes, that is the most useful part. From Alex. And then thank you, Ethan. I enjoy reading your paper, and so wonderful to listen to you today and take us all a little deeper from Larissa. Huge gratitude. I've just been like scribbling away this whole time, so a whole range of different questions.
Right.
And yeah, we spoke about the application and praxis of these studies, and I'm interested in what intervention points for relational values and how they're cultivated in practice, and what methodologies of implementation. Obviously, that this is where the research is at, but yeah, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts
on where to from here.
Yes, yeah.
Well, what I think is a really important question is how do we start writing policies that are based on relational values? Because so much of the policy landscape is based on instrumental values. And even, climate change policies, environmental policies, we're trying to do good work, but we're still working from the base values and assumptions of a system that just like doesn't make sense anymore. And so that is a question in the forefront of my mind, is like, what does it look like to write policies from a relational values perspective? And my thoughts are this: it looks like less stuff, less money sort of focusing on soil health analysis and those sorts of technologies to assess that kind of thing. It's money directed more at like supporting farmer peer networks, which we all know is like the way that farmers learn and connect and change. Peer networks are super, super important. Even things like educational opportunities, making them more accessible with things like low stress livestock handling, which low stress livestock handling is all about the relationships between people and cattle. So it at a policy level, it's relational because it's supporting relational a shift into like focusing on the education and improving farmers' thoughts and practices, but also at a practical level on the ground, it's also a prioritization of relational values. The other thing from some other research that we've been doing, we've been looking at monitoring, and so for context, we interview 60 ranchers across the US every year for 4 years. And basically 100% of those ranchers have said that monitoring methods that they use, classically like scientific methods, to like get your transects out and look at how much pasture is growing and that sort of thing. Like they find the statistics, the data that comes out of that interesting, but they never use it in their decision making. Or it's just too intensive to do the monitoring itself. What all of their decision making sort of comes from is an informal sort of monitoring where they're just looking with their eyes, or they know, like they've been in these landscapes their entire lives, and they can feel, even in ways that maybe they can't explain sometimes, subtle differences, and they base their decisions on those things. So from a relational values perspective and from a good use of money, public money perspective in terms of like rangeland monitoring, I think we should be investing in the methods that are relational that farmers and ranchers already use for good environmental management and improving those. Like if they have reasonably good observation skills, like what can we do to help them like have like phenomenal observation skills, and make decisions off them rather than trying to force them into this kind of scientific paradigm way of monitoring. That is classically what we're doing at the moment. Not to say that that's bad. It's not bad. It's just not being used.
There's something deeply sovereign about that as well, instead of, focusing on these mechanisms and sort of, this weird outdated skeleton of how things, the shape of what it needs to look like, and actually investing in how these individuals, people as infrastructure and how they can, and then, the system emerges, systemically out of them. And that's, that is community-led, grass-led, and what sort of structures will emerge from that. This is a really, 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 really fascinating distinction. I'm very excited. We've got a few comments from Manu here as well. I can super relate to the outside pressures. And yes, the health policies are also not based on relational values, which is crazy. And Ethan, this is such a really important point. Policy writing and monitoring in areas of permaculture education and health needs a big redesign to be based on relational values. Yeah, completely agree. I'll pass to you, Toad.
Yeah, no, thank you. I've got two questions and I'm aware of the timing, so I'm trying to synthesize that in some way. Well, I guess the first one I can make a comment is what you were saying about observation really reminds me of like asset-based community development approaches as opposed to deficit ones, which is fantastic. And I guess then the question I would ask is kind of because you could kind of call permaculture the hippie sister of regen ag in a lot of ways, or a little bit the homesteading hippie sister of regen ag. Sorry, the words are failing me in this moment. How do we orientate permaculture to kind of move towards relational values and also be in solidarity with movements like regen ag or agroecology? Where do you find permaculture within that ecology, that social ecology?
Well, I actually think permaculture does a great job already with relational values, and the reason I think that is because of the permaculture ethics.
Hmm.
Earth care, people care, fair share. Like they are pretty much in practice, they're relational values.
Hmm.
And Regen Ag does not have ethics like that, um, which yeah makes it harder. Like the less explicit sort of ways you can articulate relationality and also regeneration makes it harder to prevent co-optation. Because then you end up in this like, what's the definition conversation that goes in circles and forever, and then yeah, takes you down other paths. But I think all these movements, sometimes in between these movements, we can, as I said, get pitted against each other a little bit. Like, you know, our way is the way to do it, not your way. But actually, what we are hoping for is a diverse agricultural world, and these different movements attract different people for different reasons, inspire different people for different reasons, and we want people to get inspired. And when you've got this like huge, powerful shitstorm that is industrial agriculture, it's not going to be just permaculture that like rises up and takes that on. It might be though like permaculture and agroecology and regen and holistic management and organics and biodynamics and like all of these other options that just like tap into all these different unique contexts and people and inspirations. And so I think we just got to like be really careful not to cut another approach down, which might be inspiring a different group of people, to get involved and to change to varying degrees. They also have varying degrees of like transformative potential and like how radical they are, but that is also important to have that scale in the movement spectrum.
Thank you so much. And lastly, guys, in asking every speaker a particular question, so I'll hand over to you, Guy.
I'm just gonna sort out some pictures, so I'll pass that back to you.
Thank you, Guy. I'll be the one to ask it today. It was a quote that came from Jessica Hutchings on the first day, and I believe it was Moana Jackson. Just wanted to clarify that last name. And it was living as if. What does it look like in the terms of relational values to live in the world as if this is happening?
Mm. Oh my God, the first thing that comes to my mind is this brilliant quote from the System's View of Life. And I wonder if I can remember what it says. But
We
it's
love a
something.
paraphrase.
Yeah, that's right. It's something along the lines of hope is not the certainty that something is going to turn out right. Hope is the certainty that doing it makes sense, regardless of how things end up turning out. And I think that for me, I come back to that a lot because everything that we're doing, regardless of whether things turn out okay or don't, is the right thing to be doing in this time and context. So we've just got to keep doing it. Yeah. And live into the integrity of that for ourselves.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's such a beautiful, beautiful way to end it. And I'll also share a comment in the chat about, yes, this vision of relational agriculture is absolutely aligned with asset-based community development and how traditional health knowledge is the healthcare wellness extension of traditional ecological knowledge. Their own research is modeling the networks of decentralized approaches of multiple complementary approaches. Just wanted to speak that comment into the space because I was like, that's juicy. Thank you, Alex. And thank you so much, Ethan, for coming today and being generous with the work that you do in the world and with us and like bridging those spaces between spaces that do not want to talk to us or see any value in the relational work we're doing, especially in agriculture, but in academia more widely, and creating languages and bridges and also intervention points to begin to talk about relational values.
Yeah.
And all of this, that work that you're doing, thank you so much.
No worries. No, thanks for having me. It's so good to join the program.